Kodak used to be king when it came to cameras and film.
Kodak's got the instant camera you've been waiting for. Instant color photographs, that's what the handle's for, so carry on.
In the 1970s, Kodak had a near monopoly of the US photography market, accounting for 90% of film and 85% of camera sales. Kodak's share price peaked around the mid-1990s, but shortly after, it fell off a cliff. The move to digital photography in the early 2000s hit the company hard. Ironically, Kodak actually invented the first digital camera back in 1975. But at the time, film was the company's golden egg, and executives were hesitant to change.
Most of the rank and file of the company had built their careers on being really good at chemistry, on developing chemical processes and advancing the chemical photosensitive photography. And so a future that didn't include them was a really tough pill to swallow.
By 2012, Kodak was a shadow of its former self.
Eastman Kodak filed for bankruptcy today in a bid to survive a liquidity crisis. The company has had years of falling sales and the decline of its film business.
Kodak emerged from bankruptcy in September of 2013 as a much leaner company, mostly focused on high-speed digital printing technology and flexible packaging for consumer goods. After a short stint in phone and tablet making, Kodak raised eyebrows in 2018 after it announced its foray into cryptocurrency.
Kodak, the once premier Humboldt camera company, is the latest to jump on the crypto craze. Kodak today announced a partnership with Wen Digital to launch a, quote, major blockchain initiative and cryptocurrency.
The announcement gave Kodak stock a temporary boost. But as the novelty wore off, so too did the stock market's excitement. Now, as coronavirus sweeps across the world, Kodak has another opportunity to revive its business.
With this new agreement, my administration is using the Defense Production Act to provide a $765 million loan to support the launch of Kodak Pharmaceuticals. Kodak will now produce generic, active pharmaceutical ingredients.
The film and photo industry actually developed many of the analytical chemistry techniques needed to make those very high purity chemicals. And so applying those expertise to pharmaceutical manufacturing is a strong application of that expertise.
But the company is already hitting some major speed bumps. The $765 million government loan falls under the Defense Production Act, a law that allows the president to control the production and distribution of scarce materials deemed essential to the national defense. Kodak was already making hand sanitizer, face shields, and parts for ventilators in the fight against COVID-19. But this loan would have Kodak manufacturing critical pharmaceutical components that have been identified by the FDA as essential, but have lapsed into chronic national shortage. More specifically, under this loan, Kodak would make key starting materials, known as KSMs, and active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, for essential drugs at the company's existing manufacturing facilities in Rochester, New York.
KSMs are key starting materials, so that's the first step before you even start to make an API. And because we're talking about oral solid drugs, in simplest words, they are chemicals that you start with, and then you manufacture active pharmaceutical ingredients, and then you make the finished goods, where the API is converted into a form that can be administered.
This current situation has brought a lot of awareness to how vulnerable and how outsourced and how fragile the pharmaceutical supply chain is. So the idea to domesticate production of a lot of these drugs came from taking a hard look at where all these drugs come from due to the demand shock brought on by the pandemic. However, once that production is in place and the capacity is domestic, it should be able to make drugs for all kinds of different things.
Kodak says it's already making key starting materials.
The key starting materials we're doing today, there's regulated and unregulated. We've been making the unregulated ones for other pharmacies. We can't disclose who they are the last couple of years. So, we are doing this today. And then we'll get certified to do the regulated, so as we build up the facilities.
The U.S. currently depends on China for the majority of its pharmaceutical ingredients.
We do produce some API in the U.S., but it's largely at higher cost than can be produced in China and India, and that's the reason why U.S. production for the generic industry has declined.
But if the US can bring API production home, there's lots of money to be made. The global API market size in 2018 was around $164 billion. By 2026, that market is expected to grow to $261 billion. A senior government official told CNBC that KMS production currently makes up about 3% of Kodak's revenue. As part of the deal, Kodak is expected to eventually produce as much as 25% of the country's ingredients for generic pharmaceuticals. On the day the deal was announced, Kodak's chief executive reportedly said that he expects pharmaceutical ingredients to make up 30 to 40% of Kodak's business over time. But the loan is still far from a done deal.
So in its latest quarterly earnings report, Kodak reiterated that the loan has not gone through and that it's just a letter of interest, which means it's non-binding.
Now, government scrutiny over the deal is putting Kodak's future as a drug maker into question.
Kodak's potential deal for a government loan to help make generic drugs is being put on hold. In a tweet late Friday, the International Development Finance Corporation, a U.S. government agency, says the recent allegations of insider trading raise serious concerns and the deal will not proceed until they are cleared. The SEC is reportedly in the early stages of a probe, and Kodak said Friday it is conducting an internal review. Those Kodak shares down 40% in the pre-market.
The initial loan announcement sent Kodak stock soaring and the company's valuation skyrocketing.
The valuation of the company before the announcements was, something in the neighborhood of $100 million, $112 million. After this announcement, and when the stock at one point was a $60 stock, this was a $4.5 billion company.
For a stock that was basically flatlined over the past 2 years, Kodak's spike raised eyebrows, both from investors and officials. And what's even more puzzling is that Kodak's stock saw a massive movement a day before the government deal was announced.
The day before the public announcement, the company sent the press release to a few media outlets in Rochester, New York, where Kodak is based. The company said that it meant for that release to include an embargo time, but since it didn't, journalists published the information.
The stories were pulled shortly after, but by that point, the cat seemed to be out of the bag. Trading volume of Kodak shares jumped from about 117,000 shares on July 20th to about 1.6 million shares on July 27th, the day before the announcement. The incident prompted an SEC investigation into Kodak's disclosure of the loan, but questions are also swirling around Kodak's executive compensation practices and possible insider trading.
Filings show that the executive chairman, as well as one other boardman, bought stock about a month prior to the announcement of that deal, when negotiations were already underway. Additionally, the executive chairman was granted 1.75 million additional options that can be converted into stock the day before that deal was announced. So some, including Senator Warren, have asked for an investigation into the timing of the announcement as well as the timing of the compensation.
In an emailed statement to CNBC, a Kodak spokesperson said, Mr. Continenza has regularly purchased Kodak shares with his own money since joining the company in 2013. Because he strongly believes in the long-term success of the company, Mr. Continenza has purchased shares at nearly every available window in which he is eligible since he joined the company. He has not sold a single share of stock during his time at Kodak.
The timing, it seems extraordinary. Obviously, on a day-over-day paper gain, we're talking about tens and tens of millions of dollars that were gained by the executive chairman based upon where the stock moved to and even where the stock sits today.
Amid the controversy, President Trump is also now distancing himself from Kodak.
I wasn't involved in the deal. The concept of the deal is good, but I'll let you know. We'll do a little study on that. We'll find out. If there is any problem, we'll let you know about it very quickly. But I wasn't involved in it.
At first glance, choosing a camera company to produce pharmaceuticals may seem odd, but experts say it's not that far-fetched. In fact, there's precedent.
Fujifilm has been Kodak's main nemesis in the photography space forever, and they successfully pivoted into pharmaceutical manufacturing many years ago, and now they are a prominent manufacturer of both precursors and pharmaceuticals in the United States today.
When an outbreak of Ebola ravaged Africa in 2014, Fujifilm produced Avigen, an anti-flu drug to treat the disease. Now, Fujifilm has also mobilized in the fight against COVID-19. In July, the U.S. government awarded a $265 million contract to Fujifilm to expand the country's coronavirus vaccine manufacturing capacity at its facility in College Station, Texas. At its North Carolina facility, Fujifilm is already working to supply Novavax with bulk drug substance for a coronavirus vaccine. Kodak also has some experience in pharmaceuticals. In 1988, Kodak purchased Sterling Drug Inc., which made Bayer aspirin and other pharmaceutical products for about $5.1 billion. Kodak later sold Sterling to SmithKline Beecham to concentrate on its core businesses.
Both photography chemical development and pharmaceutical development is an iterative process where you take a set of known building blocks and combine them in different arrangements to produce a wide combinatoric library of chemicals that you can test either for their photosensitivity or for their safety and efficacy as a drug. And so being able to work with many combinations of your starting materials is a key competence of both of those fields.
In addition, both photo and drug chemical development need to be highly controlled. In fact, Kodak's chemical processes were so perceptive, it even accidentally discovered the U.S. was testing the atomic bomb.
When the United States tested the first bomb at the Manhattan Project in New Mexico, some of the minute radiation signatures from the blast in New Mexico made it all the way to their production facility and essentially ruined a batch of film because their process was so sensitive and so carefully controlled that they were able to monitor that.
Finally, Kodak also has the space to expand this part of its business.
Our vast infrastructure of Eastman Business Park includes a wide variety of industrial utilities, including steam, gas, electric, wastewater treatment, access to 13 miles of rail in the park, as well as fire safety and security services.
It still remains to be seen if Kodak can get its hands on the government's $765 million loan. But even if it does, the company faces several challenges in establishing a foothold in the pharmaceutical market.
From producing KSMs to producing API is not a big jump, but it probably requires a different type of a toolkit that a company may need to have in terms of the type of talent that they have in the manufacturing and R&D department.
When Fujifilm got into the pharmaceutical industry many years ago, they still had many of their innovative people in photochemistry still at the company. And so it would have been a really great idea for Kodak to do it many years ago as well. It remains to be seen whether they still have the expertise in their company to pull it off at this point.
Even for an existing pharma company, right, that makes API or makes products of one type, for them to go on and venture into making a different type of product, that requires a bit of a learning curve, or that requires them doing R&D, getting the requisite approvals from the FDA, making sure that their facility and their manufacturing processes are CGMP compliant. In the process to get even a single product approved requires an individual application to the FDA.
But perhaps the biggest challenge for Kodak will be competing with a foreign pharma market, where labor costs are cheaper and regulation laxer.
Unless there is a line of sight that there's willingness to absorb that additional cost in order to be self-reliant as a country, I think that it will be hard to see a lot of players in the industry jump in.
These challenges may be why the government is not putting all of its eggs in one basket. A senior government official told CNBC that the idea all along was to give loans to a number of companies in an effort to bring generic drug production back to the U.S.